It's an ordinary night in the heart of Arkansas. More precisely, it's the night of April 27, 2014. In the quiet town of Vilonia, a community accustomed to the crackling of cicadas and the gentle murmur of grasslands, a woman named Helen Greer watches from the front window of her home. But this is no ordinary night. In the distance, a dense shadow begins to take shape. It's not fog, it's not smoke. It's a swirling column, immense and violent, seemingly torn from the pages of a biblical tragedy. The atmosphere is charged, the air heavy, and what's approaching isn't just wind, it's pure destruction. A beast from the sky. Helen, paralyzed for a moment by terror, knows there's no time to waste. She's heard it before. She's seen it before. And this time the threat is right under her roof. Without a second thought, she runs to the only place that might offer her refuge. An underground bunker, built with her own savings, designed to withstand the unthinkable. But sometimes, the unthinkable becomes inevitable. The winds don't just surround her house. They engulf it. They tear it apart. They consume it. And in a matter of seconds, Helen Greer is no longer part of the world of the living. Her shelter wasn't enough. The monster was faster. But to understand this story, we must go back 3 years. In 2011, the residents of Vilonia were already familiar with the language of tornadoes. On that occasion, what descended from the sky was a storm classified as an EF2. For experts, a storm of that magnitude, moderately strong on the enhanced Fujita scale, is capable of tearing off roofs, toppling trees, and damaging solid structures. Nothing a town in the south hasn't faced before. But for the residents of Vilonia, that storm wasn't just a statistic, it was a warning. The streets were covered in debris. Entire families lost their homes. Although the casualties were few, the trauma was enormous. No one said it openly, but everyone was thinking, what if this happens again? No one imagined that question would be answered so soon, because 3 years later, the heavens opened again. And this time, it didn't come with gentle warnings or room for error. The tornado that struck Vilonia in 2014 wasn't an EF2. It was one of those creatures that form with almost supernatural fury. With winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour, this new storm swept away everything in its path, leaving deep scars on the land and in the collective memory of those who survived. What makes this story even more disturbing is not only the violence of the natural phenomenon, but its repetition, the recurrence. The idea that a community can be struck not once, but twice in such a short period of time. And that the second time can come when the wounds of the first have not yet healed. When the National Weather Service experts turned on their computers that morning, the tension was already palpable. Screens flashed with bright red alerts. On the weather models, the heart of Arkansas appeared to be marked with an X. It wasn't just any prediction. That day, meteorologists decided to issue a warning only issued in extraordinary situations. A level 4 out of 5 on the severe storm risk scale. And while those numbers sound cold and distant, what they really meant was this. Hell was preparing to descend from the skies. The warning was clear and direct. High-intensity tornadoes could form, the kind that don't just pass by, but stay. Tornadoes capable of traveling for miles without losing strength. Hungry tornadoes. Greg D., a local meteorologist with years of experience and nerves of steel, dared to say what many were thinking, but few dared to vocalize. I am seriously concerned. Any thunderstorm that forms over Arkansas tomorrow has the potential to become tornadic. And he was right. Because the ingredients for disaster weren't just present, they were perfectly aligned. It was as if the atmosphere itself were conspiring, but the worst was yet to come. Dawn breaks, and with the new light comes not calm, but more anxiety. It's the day of the event, and from the first minute, the situation begins to deteriorate rapidly. Forecasters are once again reviewing computer models, those maps of wind, temperature, and pressure that attempt to anticipate the chaos. And what they discover, doesn't ease their fears. In fact, it deepens them. More storms than expected are beginning to form over the state. The sky, which should have been clear in those early hours, is covered with the restless clouds, which not only pose a threat, but also seem to move with a mind of their own. Atmospheric data reveals chilling numbers. Air instability is skyrocketing. A critical variable known as CAPE, which measures the potential energy for storm development, reaches 4,000 joules per kilogram. To put this in perspective, levels above 2,000 are already considered capable of producing violent supercells. 4,000 is almost unprecedented. It's as if the air were charged with invisible dynamite, just waiting for a spark to detonate a catastrophe. And then comes the decision. Faced with all these indicators, faced with this accumulation of conditions perfect for chaos, meteorologists do something few have seen before. They upgrade the alert to the maximum level. Risk 5 out of 5. High risk, they call it, but among them some know it as the point of no return. That kind of warning isn't issued lightly. It's a declaration of war against heaven. A warning to everyone to understand that what's coming isn't just another storm. It's a phenomenon that will go down in history. An event that will test the resilience of a region, the responsiveness of its systems, and the willpower of its people. And while no one can know for sure what form that threat will take, all signs point to one thing. Arkansas is about to face one of the darkest days in its recent history. In the coming hours, what seemed like a simple prediction will transform into a terrifying sequence of atmospheric onslaughts. And for those who still doubted science, the heavens themselves will clarify things. Because when the atmosphere decides to turn against us, there is no wall, no shelter, no foresight that can completely stop it. And this time, the atmosphere is hungry. Suggested title: The Birth of the Monster, the Mayflower Storm. All day long, the clouds had been playing hide and seek with the horizon. In central Arkansas, storms formed like bubbles on the verge of boiling, and then disappeared before revealing their claws. For residents, the weather seemed threatening, yes, but inconsistent. And for experts, that uncertainty was worse than a clear threat. The hours passed, and the sun began to sink behind the landscape of the Deep South. The forecasters, who had sounded the highest alert hours earlier, were beginning to doubt it. What if the major event they feared never came? What if all those models, those pressure and humidity graphs, had been a false alarm? But the atmosphere, like any predator, knows how to wait. And it was just when the day seemed to be ending, when the last rays of light tinged the sky copper and indigo, that everything changed. Near a small town called Mayflower, a seemingly harmless storm cell began to grow. At first, it was just another cloud among many. But this one was different. It didn't dissipate like the previous ones. On the contrary, it began to feed on the moisture and energy the atmosphere still had to offer. In less than an hour, that cloud transformed into something else. It became the dominant storm in the system, a sort of black queen that displaced all the others from its board. And then physics came into play. As the storm expanded, a phenomenon known as wind shear, the variation in wind speed at different altitudes, began to increase dramatically. Near ground level, rotating air currents traveled at nearly 60 miles per hour. That kind of rotation, right at the level where the storm breathes, is the spark that can transform a simple cloud into a machine of destruction. The storm wasn't just growing, it was spinning. And when a supercell, one of the most powerful and dangerous structures in meteorology, begins to organize with this level of precision, the result is often devastating. At 7:06 p.m. local time, the warning became a reality. The tornado touched down just outside Conway, Arkansas. What had until then been an invisible threat became a real, tangible, roaring beast. About 30 miles north, a man named Ian Gates, a veteran storm chaser, watched the radar with a mixture of skepticism and concentration. He'd spent all day tracking storms that faded before leaping into full force. False alarm after false alarm. But this storm looked different. The structure on the radar was sharp, almost symmetrical. The rotational core wasn't just present. It was strengthening, like a steel gear turning faster and faster. Gates knew that when a storm reaches that level of visual coherence on radar, it's not a whim of technology. It's the universe screaming that something serious is happening. And he was not wrong, because what had been born south of the Mayflower wasn't just a tornado. It was the beginning of a tragedy that would mark Arkansas forever. In the coming minutes, that supercell would not only maintain its strength, but increase it. The tornado wouldn't dissipate anytime soon. Instead, it would begin a deadly path that would devastate everything in its path. Homes, schools, lives. But in that instant, south of dusk, all that could be seen was a swirling cloud touching down. And all anyone could do was run. With an almost automatic movement, Ian Gates grabbed his gear. High-resolution camera, reinforced tripod, portable weather radio, it all went with him. Without missing a beat, he turned the wheel east, knowing full well what that meant. If he wanted a chance of capturing what was happening, he'd have to get ahead of the storm's path. Position himself at the perfect angle. The hunter versus the beast. What I didn't know was that I was about to stare straight into the eyes of the most brutal tornado I'd ever witnessed. And that, coming from someone who had spent years chasing these atmospheric giants, was saying something. Normally, tornadoes start timidly. They touch the ground as if testing the waters, barely dancing over the horizon as they find their footing. But this one didn't follow the rules. Just 34 seconds after first contact with the ground, the vortex was no longer a thin serpent of wind. It had transformed into a swirling behemoth, nearly half a mile wide. To put that in perspective, wide enough to swallow 8 football fields side by side. And worse still, it wasn't whirling over empty fields or isolated forests. No, its nucleus of destruction had formed right over a community. Families, homes, cars, entire lives. Everything was trapped under the growing shadow of that colossus of wind. Carrie Tittle was at home when the warning appeared on the television screen. It wasn't the first time she'd seen one, but this time, something felt different. She walked over to the window, and what she saw looked like something from an alternate world. It was as if the whole sky had turned green, she would later recall. A strange, ghostly light colored the air. The tall, proud trees began to bend, as if an invisible force were pushing them to the ground. Without missing a beat, Carrie screamed for her family. Her husband, Rob, and their 9 children responded immediately. They all ran for the only place in the house that could offer them some protection, the hollow under the stairs. It was a tight corner, a makeshift shelter. But when you don't have a basement or time to get to an outside shelter, you use what you have. As the sound of the tornado grew louder, deeper, wilder, Carrie felt as if she were hearing the roar of an ancient beast. And then, everything disappeared. In a matter of seconds, the entire structure of the house was ripped from its foundations. Not just destroyed, not just collapsed, torn away, as if someone had decided to single-handedly erase that dwelling from the landscape. The tragedy was immediate. Rob, the father of the family, died instantly. Tori, his oldest daughter, 20, died as well. And beside her, Rebecca, a teenager of barely 14. The devastation was absolute. What remained was a scene impossible to process logically. Pieces of lives scattered across the earth. Memories torn away by the wind. The house, which had been a refuge, was now just a dot on the map. And yet, the tornado was just beginning its journey. Its speed was that of a car on the highway. Steady, swift, unstoppable. It went from an invisible threat to a lethal force in the blink of an eye. And the most disturbing thing was that it showed no signs of weakening. This wasn't an ordinary phenomenon. It was a storm with a purpose. A destructive engine fueled by the perfect combination of heat, humidity, atmospheric instability, and destiny. Heaven had opened its doors, and the monster that emerged from it had no intention of stopping. As the wind colossus moved northeast, it didn't slow down. About 3 miles east of its final point of impact, a man named Matthew Grant was in his home when he received the warning: a tornado. Instead of running for cover, Matthew did what so many others do when the human mind can't grasp the danger. He went to the window. What he saw was unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. There, silhouetted against the Arkansas hills, the vortex moved with an almost ghostly rhythm. It was wide, wider than the eye could immediately grasp, but it had no clear contours. It was partially hidden by bands of rain that wrapped around it like a misty curtain. More than a tornado, it looked like living fog, a violent whisper descending from the sky. Meanwhile, nearby cameras captured the phenomenon on video, and what was recorded was disconcerting. The tornado seemed to wobble, as if fluctuating between different shapes and strengths. Its size varied slightly, and so did its intensity. It seemed to be searching for something, perhaps balance, perhaps its next target. That target was close at hand, the small town of North Point, south of which lay a cluster of scattered houses. There, without warning, the tornado once again focused its fury. Any remaining doubts about its strength disappeared. The beast returned with renewed violence. The trees, stalwart guardians of the landscape, began to shed their bark as if flayed by an invisible blade. The topmost layer of soil was ripped away, exposing the living, bleeding earth. This kind of damage was unusual. It was the unmistakable sign that a core of enormous power was active within that vortex. The atmosphere, charged with invisible energy, was brewing something more than wind. It was giving birth to a force that defied all logic. Despite that spike in violence, as the tornado approached the most densely populated area of North Point, its behavior changed again. Instead of leveling the town, it seemed to contain itself. Only a few roofs were blown off. A few structures were damaged. But for the most part, the community was spared. This was deeply strange. Moments earlier, that same vortex had wiped out entire houses. So why had it weakened just as it reached a more vulnerable area? For experts, the answer may not lie in the sky, but in the earth, and more specifically, in the region's topography. The tornado's path originated over a mountain formation known as Brush Mountain, a ridge that rose imposingly over the landscape. From its peak, the terrain dropped steeply, and more than 1,000 feet in elevation difference lay a residential area, the site where the Tittle family had been caught hours earlier. Meteorologists believe this abrupt change in geography may have been key to the tornado's birth and erratic behavior. There is an atmospheric phenomenon known as downsloping, in which winds, moving from high elevations to low terrain, are accelerated by gravity. These downward moving winds not only become faster, but also more concentrated, and can act as pure fuel for already active storms. In this case, it's possible that the winds accelerated by the fall from Brush Mountain not only intensified the winds already present within the tornado, but also channeled even more energy into its core, as if someone had opened a secret channel to inject force into it. This could be one of the reasons why the tornado formed so quickly, reached such an extreme level of destruction, and then, equally mysteriously, weakened just when the worst was expected. Nature remains, for the most part, a teacher who teaches in silence. And sometimes, its way of explaining things to us is by leaving scars on the earth. That afternoon, as the storm moved forward and the mystery of Brush Mountain was etched on radar and in our memories, the wind reminded us that even with all our technology, we still don't fully understand the soul of a storm. The signs began to fit together like pieces of a sinister puzzle. The theory of a steep descent from Brush Mountain made even more sense when considering that, beyond the Tittle house, the terrain began to level off. And in doing so, something changed. The tornado, until then erratic but deadly, began to stabilize its force, as if it had finally absorbed everything it needed from the ground and the winds that propelled it. It was evident that an invisible energy was fueling it, pushing it forward with a will almost of its own. But far from stopping, the storm was just beginning its next act. Past the small town of North Point, the vortex showed no signs of weakness. It crossed new hills and forests effortlessly, like an animal that no longer needed to stalk. Now it simply devoured. Soon after, he emerged over a seemingly endless expanse of water, the majestic Lake Maumelle, a vital reservoir for central Arkansas. At that same time, a man named James Harris, a technician with Central Arkansas Water, was performing routine inspections of the lake levels. James wasn't a meteorologist or a storm chaser. He was just a night worker, making sure thousands of people's water supplies were safe. He was walking casually along the equipment dock when something caught his eye. A dark mass, huge, imposing. There, right on the water. "I'm not sure what the heck that is, but that could be a tornado," he muttered. Seconds later, his doubt became certainty. "Oh my God! I think that's a tornado!" he exclaimed as the wind began to roar like a spectral locomotive. The air was changing. The pressure was dropping. Something huge was crossing the lake. What I was witnessing was no ordinary phenomenon. It was an atmospheric colossus. As the tornado moved across the surface of Lake Maumelle, it grew even larger. What had once been a towering, rotating mass now became a living wall of destruction, expanding to nearly a mile wide. The sky, already gray and heavy, darkened even further. It was as if the day itself had been devoured. Where there had been light, only shadow remained. Where there had been water, there was now a storm that seemed to suck it from the bowels of the world. These weren't just gusts of wind. They were the breath of a force that knew no bounds. From the air, thermal radar images showed something almost unimaginable. The vortex had grown to touch nearly both ends of the lake. The rain bands, internal rotation, and the system's central temperature made it clear that this supercell wasn't just powerful. It was historic. And while no one could know for sure at the time, this storm wasn't ready to dissipate. What had just happened over Lake Maumelle wasn't the end of the road. It was just another chapter in a night where nature decided to remind humans who had the last word. Crossing the dark waters of Lake Maumelle wasn't just a change of scenery. It was the threshold to a new chapter of destruction. Because on the other side of the lake, destiny was already waiting. The tornado's path, as if drawn by an invisible hand, aligned directly with the heart of the town of Mayflower, Arkansas. Before reaching him, the storm grazed a small cluster of homes south of Roland, perched on the edge of a hill. The terrain rose again, as if attempting to offer some resistance. But behind that ridge came a brutal drop. The mighty Arkansas River waited below, marking a new and dangerous drop in altitude, close to 1,000 feet. From the top of one of those elevated neighborhoods, a mother named Kelly Thompson held her shaky phone. She filmed, hoping to capture something far away. What her camera captured was more than she expected. A monster, wide and dark, moving slowly. It wasn't a skinny tornado dancing across the fields. It was a towering mass, seemingly devouring the horizon. The sound of wind is heard over the video as the camera shakes. Dozens of miles away, at the National Weather Service offices, analysts watched the Doppler radar data with growing concern. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The tornado wasn't just staying alive, it was growing. On their screens, a new signature appeared, a debris ball, clearly visible on radar. It was irrefutable evidence that the vortex was lifting objects from the ground, wood, rooftops, trees, vehicles, and throwing them thousands of feet into the air. That could only mean one thing. What was coming was a threat of a larger scale. The authorities were quick to respond. At 7:30 p.m., a tornado emergency was declared for the entire region. The alert wasn't a simple warning. It was a plea. Storm spotters and the National Weather Service's Doppler radar are tracking a tornado of extreme proportions. This is a tornado emergency for Mayflower and Vilonia. Take shelter immediately. Nearly 1/3 of all tornadoes in the state occur after dark, Don't wait. Seek shelter now. Just a few miles north of the river, in a quiet community of large homes and tidy yards called the River Plantation Subdivision, no one imagined the disaster that was coming. Among its residents, a woman named Tanara Haney stood outside. She hadn't yet heard the alarm. The air was thick, saturated with moisture, and had that strange greenish tinge that survivors often remember. What Tanara didn't know was that, across the river, a tornado of unusual magnitude was descending upon them like a titan in the darkness, and it wouldn't stop. The sky, which minutes before had been merely gray, began to transform into a disturbing mix of deep green and dull blue hues, a color that belongs neither to day nor night, but to the fringes of the possible, a harbinger that what was to come was not just another storm. It was an event that would break the rules of predictability. That's when a resident started recording. The camera captured something that seemed to emerge from nowhere. A blurry mass engulfed in rain, sliding silently across the wide Arkansas River. There was no lightning, no thunder, just a low hum, as if the earth itself was vibrating under the pressure of what was coming. And although at first glance the tornado seemed to almost dissolve into the curtains of water, something in the air screamed otherwise. This was real, and it was lethal. Within the beast's core, nothing remained standing. Wherever it touched ground, everything was reduced to rubble. A massive dwelling, nearly 6,000 square feet, built with reinforced structures, was completely dismantled. Its foundations were exposed, like the bones of a fallen giant. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a sequence of surgical destruction. The vortex didn't limit itself to leveling just one part of the neighborhood. It headed precisely toward the northeast section, as if it knew exactly where it was going. It was at that moment that the horror became personal. Helen Greer and her husband lived right in the tornado's direct path. They didn't have seconds to waste. Seeing the monster on the horizon, they dropped everything and ran to the pre-installed underground shelter, a reinforced steel structure beneath their home. They hunkered down there, arm in arm, listening to the roar overhead, growing like a freight train multiplied by 10. When the winds reached their peak, the entire house was literally ripped from its foundation. The upper structure disappeared as if it had never been there. And then, the unthinkable happened. A metal fragment, projected by the force of the wind as if fired from a cannon, struck the shelter door. The lock gave way. The shield that was meant to protect them shattered in an instant. Winds and debris violently burst into the small space. Helen was thrown against one of the concrete walls and died instantly. Her husband survived, but with severe injuries. He lived to tell what happened down there, to witness how even the safest shelters aren't always enough in the face of such a ruthless force of nature. From this point on, the tornado disappeared from human view. Literally. The intensity of the phenomenon reached such a point, and the rain envelope was so dense that the vortex became undetectable to the naked eye. It was no longer a visible funnel. It was a lethal fog that crept forward, devouring structures and dreams alike. The few images that exist of this stretch of the tornado do not show a rotating funnel, but rather a dense, shapeless shadow, emerging from the River Plantation neighborhood as if hell had broken loose in the mist. And then something worse came. In the path of the storm was an electrical substation, a critical facility that supplied power to much of Mayflower. And in a matter of seconds, everything changed. A series of internal explosions rocked the complex. The city lights flickered one last time and then went out. The substation was reduced to a twisted mass of smoking metal. High-voltage transmission towers, weighing tons, were folded like aluminum foil. The material damage was estimated in millions of dollars. But the human cost was just beginning. The most alarming thing wasn't the collapsed structures or the disintegrated cables. It was the silence. Because with the power out, many warning sirens stopped working. Radio stations ceased broadcasting. And in many homes, cell phones were no longer receiving signals. For those who didn't yet know what was coming, it was almost too late to prepare. The monster continued on its course. And Mayflower was just beginning to live its darkest night. Northeast of what was once an electrical substation, the ground itself began to write a new story of destruction. A small cluster of rural homes scattered across the vast countryside became the next target of an unstoppable force. Those houses, many of them not even located in the center of the path, were ripped from the ground as if they had never existed. Some vanished so completely that not even the foundations remained to attest to the fact that life had ever existed there. Across fields and hills, trees, centuries-old oaks and sturdy pines were flattened in parallel lines, as if a colossal hand had felled them with a single blow. The vegetation was reduced to brown and green carpets that blended with the mud, while the tornado, far from diminishing, seemed to grow with each breath of the earth. Its width expanded like a monster, feeding on everything it touched. And then, finally, the threshold was crossed. The vortex entered Mayflower, Arkansas. Highway to chaos. On the interstate bordering the city, hundreds of vehicles continued moving. Some drivers were returning home from work. Others were traveling to new cities, unaware that their route would lead them straight into the heart of a tragedy. Among them was Cotton Rory. His dashcam, installed to record peaceful journeys, would become a silent witness to the moment when the line between normalcy and disaster completely blurred. The recording began with a threatening sky in the background and a seemingly safe road. But within seconds, the scene changed. Cotton's voice cracked with a mixture of surprise and fear. "Oh my God! Oh my God! It's right there! I see it right there!" A roar of wind blasted through the car speakers. It felt like the air was being ripped apart in all directions. "We just got a tornado warning. My ears are popping. We're in! Yes, we're in!" There was no turning back. What had once been an escape route had become a trap with no way out. The storm chaser in front of the Colossus. A few miles away, storm chaser Ian Gates maneuvered his vehicle through gusts of rain that crashed against the windshield like crystal needles. His job was to track these storms. He lived to document the undocumentable, to face the fury of the sky. But what lay before him this time was like nothing he'd ever seen before. The tornado, now monstrous in size, was visible even at that distance. Not as a sleek, defined funnel, but as a dark mass that seemed to plummet from the sky, covering the entire landscape. It wasn't just a storm. It was an eclipse of fury and wind. Ian knew the Mayflower was right in his path, and the town had no escape route. Mayflower Center, epicenter of horror. The central area of the small town was hit with the full force of the phenomenon. What happened there cannot be described solely with numbers or measurements. It was a combination of fate, vulnerability, and superhuman strength that swept everything away. A man of about half a century of age was killed when the house he had built with his own hands was lifted like an autumn leaf and disintegrated in the air. Entire industrial facilities, warehouses, small factories were reduced to steel skeletons. Only bent beams and pulverized concrete remained. Cars on the interstate were lifted like toys, spun in the air, and crashed into the asphalt or into each other. Some were unrecognizable, others simply vanished. A machine shop that had been operating for more than 2 decades was literally leveled. Work tools were blown hundreds of meters. Hydraulic lifts were left stuck in distant fields, and not a single wall remained standing. Within minutes, Mayflower's heart stopped beating. The routine of the day was replaced by the roar of collapse. At that point, it was no longer a meteorological emergency. It had become a brutal lesson in human fragility in the face of the impersonal force of nature. And yet, the worst was yet to come. The monster moved forward with a firm step towards its next destination, and Vilonia was the name written on her path of shadows. The colossal hurricane of wind and fury was advancing inexorably toward a new challenge. A vast, dark body of water known as Lake Conway. This immense expanse of water, which in calm times reflected the sky, now found itself under the menacing shadow of the air monster. As the tornado crossed the lake, small communities around it had no chance to flee. Houses and homes, those sacred refuges where generations had lived and dreamed, were reduced to dust and rubble in a matter of minutes. More than a dozen homes were completely leveled, swept away like sandcastles in a storm. Among the victims, Robert Oliver, an 82-year-old man, met his end when his house was ripped from its foundation, carrying him unresistingly to its fate. At 7:45 p.m., the tornado completed its crusade across the lake. It had been on the ground for over 45 minutes, completely enveloped in a blanket of relentless rain and fragments of destruction suspended in the air. But the storm had not yet completed its metamorphosis. The storm is reborn with fury. As the tornado tore through a nearby mountain range, the landscape changed, and with it the storm's power. What seemed like a respite for forested areas, where damage was initially less severe, turned into a prelude to something even more ferocious. Upon passing the high ground, the vortex intensified violently. Two solid brick houses vanished completely, leaving almost no trace of their foundations, as if the earth itself had decided to reclaim them. The ground was ripped open with unprecedented brutality. Ancient trees, silent witnesses of time, were flattened and shattered, turned into splinters and twisted trunks. Amidst this destruction, Sharon Holland, a brave woman who braved the storm with her camera, captured the only known photograph of the tornado in this area. The image showed a smaller mass of wind, almost as if the monster was trying to regain its balance, preparing for the final blow. Vilonia, the final chapter of devastation. The tornado, now an unleashed colossus, accelerated its path to almost 50 miles per hour, like a beast with insatiable hunger, aiming directly for Vilonia. There, the fury knew no bounds. Every structure in its path was mercilessly pulverized. Vehicles were smashed like toys, and trees were turned into broken firewood. Among the victims of this destruction, a school built of steel and concrete, a symbol of the community, could not withstand the onslaught. Its columns bent, its walls collapsed, and the building was doomed to total demolition. On a street called Cody Lane, the tornado leveled an entire neighborhood of brick homes. The Smith family was caught in the middle of this nightmare. April and Daniel, the parents, were found in critical condition after the storm. Their young sons, Tyler and Cameron, aged 7 and 8 respectively, did not survive and died in the hospital. A close friend described the scene with words that still resonate in the collective memory. It looked more like a battlefield, more like a bombed-out area than the aftermath of a tornado. The ground was so destroyed, it looked like a bulldozer had run over it. Parkwood Meadows, a fatal neighborhood. Among the hardest hit areas was Parkwood Meadows, a newly built neighborhood that would become a tragic example of vulnerability. The houses, built with cheap nails instead of solid anchors, stood no chance against the fury of the wind. Almost every home vanished without a trace. Among the stories of loss, that of Jeffrey Hunter, a 22-year-old young man, stands out. He sent a final voice message to his mother. "Mom, it's coming right for me." Her desperate response was an attempt to maintain hope. "I love you, Jeff. You're going to survive." But fate was cruel, and she couldn't save him. Daniel Wassam, a 31-year-old man, also died while protecting his daughter, giving his life in a final act of love and courage. The end of the monster. Finally, at 8:00 p.m., after a full hour of unbridled fury, the tornado began to dissipate, leaving behind a landscape of destruction and pain. The final count was heartbreaking: 16 dead, including several children. The towns of Vilonia and Mayflower were devastated, with scars that even today, more than a decade later, remain etched on the ground and in the hearts of its inhabitants. Although the storm was classified as an EF4, not an EF5, on meteorological scales, its impact was nothing short of apocalyptic. Thank you for joining us on this powerful tour of the devastation left by the tornado in Mayflower, Vilonia, and beyond. The force of nature reminds us how fragile we are in the face of its power and the importance of always being prepared. If you want to continue exploring the most intense stories about extreme weather events, don't forget to subscribe to our Extreme Tornado channel. Click the bell to stay updated and join our community of meteorology enthusiasts. Until next time, stay safe and be aware of the forces of nature.